We're going to start with a prayer in just a minute.
All praise, O my God, be to Thee, who art the source of all glory and majesty, of greatness and honor, of sovereignty and dominion, of loftiness and grace, of awe and power. Whomsoever Thou willest, Thou causest to draw on to the most great ocean. And on whomsoever Thou desirest, Thou conferrest the honor of recognizing Thy most ancient name. Of all who are in heaven and on earth, none can withstand the operation of Thy sovereign will. From all eternity Thou didst rule the entire creation, and Thou wilt continue forevermore to exercise Thy dominion over all created things. There is none other God but Thee, the Almighty, the most exalted, the all-powerful, the all-wise. Illumine, O Lord, the faces of Thy servants, that they may behold Thee, and cleanse their hearts, that they may turn unto the court of Thy heavenly favors, and recognize Him who is the manifestation of Thyself, and the dayspring of Thine essence. Verily, Thou art the Lord of all worlds. There is no God but Thee, the unconstrained, the all-subduing. Baha'u'llah.
All right, I guess we will begin this evening. We're having some friends here and some friends joining us on Facebook, and we're happy to have all of you, any of you. We have two guests with us, special guests. They're both very special. We knew them in the Midwest, and it's fun to see them here in South Carolina. But we have Dr. June Thomas. They're each really renowned in their fields, I must say. They really are. We are honored to have them here with us. And they're very gracious to give us an extra evening. So we appreciate it very much. Dr. June Thomas is a demographer. We are sisters in sociology, but she's much more renowned than I am. But she's well known in the demography field, and she has a number of publications. One of them, her latest one, she's going to tell you about this evening. And the title is Struggling to Learn. And I don't know the subtitle by heart. I didn't really practice this.
A lot, yeah.
Do you remember what
Yeah,
is it?
yes.
Struggling to Learn.
It's an intimate history of school desegregation in South Carolina.
Okay.
That's what it is.
And so she will tell you all about that, her experience, and the setting of that book. It's a very sociological view. Her husband is Dr. Richard Thomas. He's a historian, African American Studies. They both taught at Michigan State for a number of years. And I don't know what else to say, but we're very blessed to have you with us, and we're thankful. So,
Thank you. Thank you, Carol.
and now I will get out of the way.
So, first of all, I'm here because of the publication of my latest book, which she just described, Struggling to Learn, which is about several things, but the main thing is how the Black community educated their children and youth throughout the 20th century in spite of pervasive racism. And at the heart of the book, maybe in about the middle of it, I start talking about my own experience desegregating my local high school, as well as being among the first 4 years of desegregation for Furman University. But the main purpose really is to talk about how the Black community, including my parents and teachers, all centered in Orangeburg and Orangeburg County, fought for equal education for black children. But tonight I wanted, so those are the talks that I'm giving. So last night at University of South Carolina, Saturday at the Civil Rights Museum, Cecil Williams Civil Rights Museum in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and then I'm coming back in July to talk at Clemson University to the Call Me Mister program that Roy Jones has. But tonight I wanted to do something a little different because this is a fireside and it gives me more freedom, you know. And I thought I'd tell you just a little bit of a preview of the talk that will be given at the Association for Baha'i Studies at the end of July. And the way that operates now, they aren't having live conferences. They are basically asking us to film ourselves. And then at the end of July, they'll have a conference, and you'll be able to see the videotape I've already made, the Zoom tape I've already made of myself talking, which is really weird. You know, so I taped my own talk and sent it to them, and then they'll open it to those who register for the Association for Baha'i Studies, and then they will have a live session where several of us will be in a panel and they'll ask us questions. So that's coming up at the end of July, and some of you might be interested because it's such a wonderful conference, and we haven't been able to have it in person for several years since the pandemic, but this new way of having the conference really works very well, you know, because then you can go back and see videos if you like them, and you can hear the authors of the videos, of the self-taping, you know, talking about it and so on. So it for something like that, it wouldn't have been appropriate to just talk straight about my book, right? That wouldn't have been an appropriate approach. And so what I did instead was to start by talking about the research, but only after explaining some of the Baha'i principles of racism. And then talking about how, in particularly the portion or the time frame of South Carolina that I was writing about, racism had run rampant. You know, that was the Jim Crow era. And how people began to see that there was something wrong with that, and that's of course a critical period in the growth of the Baha'i faith in South Carolina, because people began to see how negative that racism was. So that's kind of the overview of what I hope to do. So I just brought like some of the quotes. I said, well, I should use just some of the concepts or quotes from that talk. So one of the things that I did was to go back to the writings of Shohi Effendi, who is the guardian of the Baha'i faith, during the period of time that I was writing about the civil rights movement. So that would have been, his writings would have been from 1938 to 1957. In 1938, because that's when he finished writing this long letter, The Advent of Divine Justice, he actually signed it on December 25th. So that's when he finished the writing, although the book didn't come out until 1939. Excuse me. And then he passed away in 1957. But he also published letters in another book called Citadel of Faith. And so we have commentary by this leader of the Baha'i faith on racism during that period, before that period too, but I was particularly interested in that period because I was studying the civil rights movement in South Carolina. So I was looking at the comments or the things he was saying about what's wrong with racism and how it has negatively affected America. So, for example, one of the things he does is he calls racism in the United States a patent evil. So he says it's a patent evil that is so bad in this country that it caused Baha'u'llah, who's of course the founder of the Baha'i faith, and the center of the covenant, Abdul Baha, who is the son of Baha'u'llah, to call out America, not because it was so wonderful and great, which it's kind of, they do say in other places that it's wonderful and great, but it was plagued by these patent evils, right? One of which was racial prejudice. So he went on to talk about that concept in that same book, Advent of Divine Justice. He says, it is by such means as this that Baha'u'llah can best demonstrate to a heedless generation his almighty power. And by such means, it means singling out Americans and helping them to understand racism. His almighty power to raise up from the very midst of a people immersed in a sea of materialism, so that's one thing he said that was bad about Americans, a prey to one of the most virulent and long-standing forms of racial prejudice, and then he goes on to name other flaws of American character. But that particular one of the most virulent and long-standing forms of racial prejudice, is really notable because, of course, there are other places that have racial prejudice, but he's calling out American prejudice as one of the most virulent and long-standing. And then he went on to say that as this happens, the fabric of present-day society heaves and cracks under the strain and stress of events and calamities, one of which is separation from race, of race from race. So again, this analogy is that our society, which we sometimes think of as one of the greatest in the world, is suffering from heaves and cracks due in part to the differences and the conflict and the prejudices between different races. And I don't know how much more of this you can stand, but then he goes on to say, as to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which for well nigh a century has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society, it should be regarded as constituted the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage of this evolution. Now, this phrase is well known to many of us in the Baha'i faith. We've heard this and talked about this many times. When I was studying for the talk, though, I noticed the first part of the sentence. You know, I was so busy going around saying most vital and challenging issue that I have forgotten the first part of the sentence. And the first part of the sentence says, talking about racial prejudice, the corrosion of which, so he's calling that a corrosion, which has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society. So that is as clear a description of the effects of racial prejudice as we could hope for. And that particular one, of course, also came from Advent of Divine Justice, but he said similar things as he continued to talk about the citadel of faith. Well, this suited my purposes very well because that's exactly what I was studying. Now, I started actually looking at what was happening in terms of black education and the suppression of black education dating from 1869. I started at 1869 to 1860s because I had specific incidents that I wanted to talk about in the development of black educational institutions, such as historically black colleges. And the two that I talk about are Claflin and South Carolina State College. And then I went on to talk about what happened in South Carolina in the 1890s when Pitchfork Ben Tillman had essentially pressed for a new state constitution which defined what the races were and said quite clearly that if you had 1/8 African blood, that you were colored, and that everyone else was white, and that colored and white could not marry, and they could not go to school together. That's in the 1895 state constitution. And before that, there had been, basically, especially during Reconstruction, there had not been those firm lines. At the University of South Carolina, during Reconstruction, most of the students were black. So this was a break from the history of what was beginning after the Civil War under Reconstruction, a loosening of those ties, which of course ended with 1877 in Reconstruction, when the federal soldiers left. And people who were left basically were of the larger white society were taking back land, taking away rights, and so on and so forth. So I talk about that in the book, and then I talk about what happened in the early 1900s, how difficult it was for black teachers. I talked in particular about one woman who taught on John's Island in the Sea Islands, and what it was like to be paid 1/3 the amount that a white teacher was paid, even though you were teaching possibly 80 or 90 children. And the white teachers were teaching maybe 20 or 30, so I kind of talked about that. And then I got up to the 30s and the 40s, and that's when I began to dissect how the society at that time was not meeting this criterion that Shobi Effendi was talking about. So there are several ways in which that happened. One was the removal of voting rights of black people. That had taken place over some period of time. Another was basically peonage. So slavery had turned into agricultural peonage, and basically sharecropper system. And at that time, in the 30s and 40s, most of the South Carolinian black community were in agricultural areas where they had very few rights and very much oppression. And I did a parallel looking at what that meant in terms of schools, in terms of school finance, what it meant in terms of the quality of schools, and how people began to be concerned about this in ways that led to court lawsuits, such as the Briggs v. Elliott case in Clarendon County. So of those different ways that racism was manifest, voting and economics, and of course public accommodations, as well as unequal school financing and unequal schools, I focus on schools. And so the parallel here is that at the same time that Shobi Effendi was writing these things and encouraging members of the Baha'i community to let go of any form of prejudice that they might hold, in South Carolina, we still had this ironclad system of racial segregation that was not just separate, but grossly unequal, with the suppression of black children, black education. So I show charts and things that kind of say this. So I tell the story again in this book about how people began to file suits, starting with Clarendon County, against the system of oppression. And as you know, many of those suits became, they actually went up to the Supreme Court. The Briggs v. Elliott one went all the way to the Supreme Court and was folded into the Brown v. Topeka, Kansas case, which finally in 1954 declared that legally enforced racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional, And so people got very upset, and I wrote about the responses of many, particularly white segregationists to this. And then the excitement died down because they realized that nobody was going to desegregate in South Carolina. So the court passed this ruling, but in 1955, a year later, they said, well, this has to happen in due course, And so, of course, the Southern public school systems and governors and politicians, with a few exceptions, ignored that ruling and continued to keep segregated schools grossly unequal. With, really, 10 cents paid per black student and $1 paid for white students, or with buses, for white students and not for black students. Except when they were trying to show that they were trying to make the schools equal so the courts would not force desegregation. So in 1952 or 1953, they started putting more money into the black schools to try to pretend that they were equal. So I happened to be born about that time. So I take up the story of what happened. So I was born in Orangeburg on Claflin's campus because my parents lived in a faculty house. And my father had a parsonage, so he was a minister. We went to Charleston for a few years. But then when he came back to Orangeburg, which would have been 1956, by that time, it was clear that the only response to this segregated school system was going to be just trying to prop up the black schools, but not really giving them equal. For example, so the black schools wouldn't have calculus and they wouldn't have physics. They would just have, and they'd only have one language, but the white schools. So there was still inequality, but when you looked at the schools, they looked better starting in the 50s. But in my hometown, 1955, people, the NAACP started filing suit, and including the minister of my church. And so I give that history, and then still by 1964, there was no movement in terms of critical movement away from segregation. So my parents filed suit, along with other parents and black parents in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And so that's when 13 of us desegregated this high school to horrible effect. I won't go into detail about that, but one of my classmates said it was hell on earth, and that's pretty accurate. In the book, I have just one chapter when I kind of did like post-experience narrative when I just talked about what it felt like to be in those classrooms. But I could never have written that now. I wrote it like 40 years ago. I realized I was forgetting, and I wanted to record that. So I wrote down little pieces of days that I could remember and saved it. And that's what I put in the book. So what you read in the book, if you see like the really bad descriptions of what that school was like, I wrote those years ago because I tried to forget. I wrote them so I could forget. So the rest of it is pretty, it's like me now, but I wrote it before I could forget. So, so then what do you do with that? So what I do, like when I'm describing in the 50s what some of these people were saying about why they couldn't desegregate schools, and I actually worked in USC archives. I'm ashamed to tell you, I was here for weeks, and I didn't call anybody.
I have
because I would literally, I'd check into the hotel. I'd get up in the morning. I tried to get to the there's a Hilton. It's very close to campus. and I walking distance to the libraries, and South Caroliniana is there as also the political collections. So I'd be there when they opened because they would close at 5, and I had this little iPad which has a tiny scanner in it. And this also has a scanner, and so I just stood there and I scanned and I scanned and I scanned and I scanned from these different collections, you know, and basically I went home at night and tried to make sense of it all and organize it. But I was, you know, here for long periods working on this. And some of it was very difficult. Like there was one person who was the segregationist journalist, and you know, just rabid racist comments, you know, that he was making about why colored people were not good enough, Negroes were not good enough to sit with white children. So this atmosphere had carried over to the high school by the time we got there, you know, just wholesale resistance of the white community that translated into the form of ostracism and harassment and sometimes physical attacks, although I never had those, but the boys got them. I think I was attacked once, but some of the boys got beat up, you know, every other day, you know. So what I say in the chapter when I'm describing this man is I say he wrote to different white liberal leaders in the state to see what they thought about racial prejudice. And there were white people who didn't agree with this. I have the letters. The letters are sitting there in University of South Carolina, you know, in their archives. There were people in the political collections. There were people that wrote back and said, all human beings are one and we don't understand, you know, why all this fuss, you know. So in the book, when I finished describing him, I described some of these people and what they said in their letters. And then I say, and there was one community in the 50s that actually practiced interracial association. And of course it was the Baha'i faith, there was nobody else, you know. So I used the letters and I used just my knowledge of the South Carolina Baha'i community at that time, which comes from mainly Louis Venters, and also, of course, from Abercrombie's book. I haven't gotten to the Truly White book yet, but I'm sure it's there too, to just kind of counteract this racist demagogue's talk, you know. So I say what he says, and then I say what else was happening with these whites who had a conscience and who were not accepting this, and with the Baha'i community. So and I didn't put too much in the book about the Baha'i community, only when I needed to put it in because I had no publisher. I wanted to get it published with a secular press, and I knew if I went whole hog with the Baha'i, you know, they would not publish it. So I left just enough in to make sure that people, if they're reading, if they're interested in the book, they'd have to read about the Baha'i faith, because that's the only community I could hold up to say during this period there was just one community that didn't believe this and that worked together and that socialized together. Then gradually I start bringing in examples in my own life. So that's from the 50s, right? I was like just a kid. I didn't see that. I'd never heard of Baha'i. But then I described the day at the end of the book, of the chapter on high school experience. I described the day I first heard about the Baha'i faith. And I was standing right outside my church, Trinity Methodist Church in Orangeburg, and I was talking to some guy. We were always having marches, you know, always having demonstrations and protests, because this church was the heart of the civil rights movement in Orangeburg. So I met this guy. He went to South Carolina State College, and we were just talking, you know, as a high school student hanging out with the big time college kids who did the demonstrations. I was never allowed to demonstrate or picket, you know, so all I could do was watch and help make signs, but, but I was there. And so this would have been 1967. And just in conversation, I said, I don't understand why are these white people in my high school so mean? I think they used the word mean. You know, and so I tell this story in the book, you know, so he looks at me and he says, "Oh, you should look into the Baha'i faith." And I say, you know, the thing you do, the who, the what. So what is that, you know? So it turned out to be Steve Moore, who knew several of the Baha'is in Greenville, and who knew Richard, actually. He somehow connected with Richard in Michigan. And so, again, it's not much, but it's there at the end of this chapter, and it's kind of like an antidote to the chapter, you know, to help you understand that somehow I began to meet people with a different concept, you know. And then I go through and I talk about Furman. I was there in 1967, 1968, and as it happened, so that would have been, I entered in 1967. Joseph Vaughn had desegregated that school in 1965, January, and he was a Baha'i. So in my chapter on Furman, I describe how I described Joe. He was just this wonderful guy. I don't know if any of you knew him, but he was just a phenomenal guy. He passed away over 20 years ago. But he was one of the people that Abercrombie knew in Greenville. And I was doing research in the Furman archives. So I went to Furman and looked at those archives, and they also have some online. And I came across this article that Joe Vaughn had written in the spring of 1967, just before I got there, Why I Am a Baha'i. And he wrote it in the student newspaper. Can you believe that? He wrote it in the student newspaper. So I described what he wrote and what the concepts were, you know. So I use the, I try to insert occasional examples of how the Baha'is were always different. You know, they were always trying to live out what Shoghi Effendi said they should live out. You know, so the book ends. It ends in 2020 or so, when I describe what happened with school integration and school desegregation in Orangeburg, and then in the I have an epilogue where I describe how I transferred. I met the Baha'is in Greenville. They suggested that I transfer up to Michigan State. They knew some people in Michigan that I met as well, and one of them said, "Yeah, if you went to Michigan State, there's another nice guy there. His name is Richard Thomas." You know, so I described that, and how I eventually decided to become a Baha'i, because I was trying to deal with this history that I'd been through with that desegregation experience, and that's how the book ends. Well, it doesn't end, no. So it ends with me going back to Furman in January of 2020, because they were having their first day to honor Joseph Vaughn for being the first black student to desegregate Furman, and they asked me, because they knew about me, because I knew him, because I've been going there to do research. So the archivist remembered me, because I've been sitting up in his, you know, doing my little thing, right? I've been sitting up in his archives doing my little thing. So he knew that I had been in school with Joe, and they asked me to come back and give a talk. And so the book ends with that talk, with that trip back to Furman, and talking about how affirming it was to see this student honored, you know, this Baha'i student honored. Now they put up a statue of him at Furman University, and the Baha'i community said a prayer and said made a few comments, because the university recognizes that he was a Baha'i. You know, so it's not a Baha'i book, but boy, is it in there.
Great.
So
That's so good.
maybe that's enough. So
Yeah, that's
I
wonderful.
said more than I expected to say, but
That's
maybe you
great.
have questions
That's
or something.
Well, how do you feel about Orangeburg now? How do you think Orangeburg's doing racially?
Yeah, so
Or South Carolina, for that matter. But
yeah, so the book gets really weak when it's the present, because I moved away 50 years ago. 51. We've been married 51 years. So it's really mostly a history book. It's I wrote it thinking that it would be useful for just the general public who wanted to know more about the civil rights movement and school desegregation, written from a personal point of view, so it didn't feel like it was too hard to read, because it's got lots of family history in there, and civil rights and history classes. So I think Black history classes, civil rights classes, school teacher education classes, particularly here in the state. It came out in March, and they're having to do a second printing already. So I think a lot of it must be my friends.
I only bought 500. I'm just teasing.
Yeah, I don't know, because they ran out. They seem to have run out.
have you had it reviewed here by anybody?
No.
Because that's a thought too, is to get a South Carolina.
Yeah, this is my first.
Review.
Yeah, yesterday was my first live talk on it, because I'm up in Michigan. I did some Zoom talks, but that's not the same, and none of them were based here. But so I do talk about I talk up to 2020 about a case, the Corda of Shame case.
Yeah.
And how that shows that there's still a lot of problems with the public school system in terms of race, but how the judge wouldn't accept that argument, that a lot of it was race. And so we have a lot of children that aren't being, so I did follow that story. But I haven't been here enough. We come to see my sister. My sister Michelle lives in Orangeburg. She works at Claflin. My mom died in 2002. My dad died in 1997. And so we stopped coming down regularly for a long period of time. So I think, it has some gaps in terms of what is South Carolina like now. But, I think there's got to be somebody here that can write that book, that can pick up.
One thing, the book is kind of timely because United South Justice is asking us now to help antagonistic groups to come together.
Yeah.
And so white and black groups are antagonistic. We're the most divided now I've ever seen in my lifetime in this country. And a lot of it is around race, and gender and everything else you can name, all these prejudices, right?
Right.
So I hope to use your book and other books like that, because Jamie's written a book. A lot of Baha'is have written books.
Jamie's book.
So when you're talking to these groups, you offer them something that will help them to get to a different place.
Yeah.
Because what's happening now in our society, we're in society building now. Community building, society building is quite different.
Yeah.
Because you got to have examples to show people that things can be done.
Mm-hmm.
So they won't get apathetic and despairing, and give up, But it's a challenge. One of the challenges that the U.S. South Carolina said you have is just this,
Right.
bringing people together.
Yeah.
Unity is one of the first things they talk about.
Yeah.
So these type of books can be helpful.
Yeah. I hope so.
As you give them to people and offer them to read them, if they glean anything from it,
Yeah.
they'll glean something called justice and unity,
Yeah.
responsibility, all the things that's lacking in our society. You know, that's just a terrible.
Yes, that's right.
So we need all the help we can get to put into society things that can help people get to another level. I deal with the NOW, the now. We're in the now. And the now changes every day. It's a little different every day.
Yeah.
But this division in our society now is damaging because it's destroying the planet
Right.
and it's destroying democracy. Two things that we need to survive. And so these books, you know, Ricky's book the same, and Vendors, Louis,
Yes.
these books should be used that way to allow people to have a tool that can get them to a different place. We cannot become more divided because we'll destroy ourselves and the planet. And so in this plan that we're in now, this will have us on a path, you know, to bring people together. And any tool that we can get to help that will be important. And we have to use it because the pattern for the way we've lived in the past is saying things and not delivering. That's been almost like a pattern for humankind, you know. Now it's about reality. And anything we can do to help folk to get into reality will be helpful.
Yeah.
Helpful certainly for them, they want to know that sometime.
Right.
But now it's about the planet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we save the planet?
Absolutely.
Can we move from being just human beings to being earthlings? So we can say this is our home. It is our home, and we have to, you started it by, education is the secret, you know, and the key, but some of the people are miseducated.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to turn it all around.
Yeah.
And that means that's just, you know, South Justice call it a colossal task for us. It's colossal. And friends believe it is colossal. Society building is different from community.
In my mind, one metaphor, analogy is to a marriage. You know, when we have folks with different ways of doing things, just like a husband and wife, we have, you know, a situation where we are trying to bring about a unity, kind of like a marriage. It needs work constantly. We need to see what happened, what went wrong in these relationships. Why did it go wrong? And so that we can prevent it from happening again, so we don't step back into the way we were. Nor do we try to solve the problem in a way that raises anger and splits us even more. And then in the future, if I remember, Abdul said that resolving the racial disunity in America is also going to impact all of the issues that are going on all over the world between different ethnic groups. And so that having this kind of learning process and mechanism for study would help with that as well. So, and I don't think it's ever going to be something that we don't have to work. We have to work, because it's easy to fall back into this, too easy.
I wanted to say, I think it's also important for African American students to have more books like this. It's important for all, but just from my 6 years of teaching at a HBCU, I'm always having to add things in. For example, teaching social theory. You know, anyway, you get the social theory book and you have W.B. Du Bois, maybe William Julius Wilson, maybe Richard Thomas, no. Maybe, but you know, but I always had to add in, so I learned for them. I had to learn about people, and the Julia Cooper, you know, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and then contemporary people, like I put in Patricia Hill Collins. You know, I could name more people in the field, but the important thing is for them to be exposed to that, and it uplifts them, I think. And it gives them, models, role models, and they feel good that, these books are out there for them. So I think that's encouraging to have more books like this, and even adding in parts of books. I'm sure you all know Code of the Street. I always put some of that book in there. I put, anyway, I'm talking too much about different books, but I think that's very encouraging to have books like this for them.
There's a wonderful passage from out of Baha'i, I think, where he talks about the contribution of writers in the faith. And that you are blessed for this great effort.
It's like storytelling. Abdul Baha was a great storyteller, and writing books and just telling stories. I'm beginning to become a premier storyteller about the faith and about the figures in the faith and stuff, especially to children, to smaller people, because they can grasp that, they can utilize it, and they can put it into their lives immediately almost. Because children can do that. And so we have to learn to do that. It's a learn kind of thing, because we can get to a point where we forget that we have little small minds trying to grasp what we're saying and what we're doing, and that's about storytelling. From my point of view, it's about storytelling.
Well, you did a great job storytelling. All those people last night really loved you and loved your book. It's great to see it.
Well, I planted some friends in the audience.
P.T. Barnum of academics.
I don't think so. I don't know about that.
There is a photograph in the book, you all probably have seen it, that to me, my wife is extremely humble, very humble. And for many years, buried in a whole bunch of junk in the house, there was this sort of faded photograph of her as a teenager shaking the hand of President Johnson.
Wow.
And maybe she can tell you about that. And I remember saying, Jim, this is, I'm a historian. And so I said, Jim, this is very important. I mean, here, teenage black girl, and you're shaking the hand of President Johnson. At the time when you were going through so much racial, hatred and what have you in the school. And I said, our grandkids, need to see this, and our kids need to see it. And so it took me some time to be able to sneak the photograph, take it someplace and get it, And I didn't tell her, and I told the people at the framing photograph place, don't call the house because I don't want June to know. But it's a precious, precious picture. It just it shows the triumph of one's spirit. You see, and so that if you get a chance, you just want to just take a look at that, because that to me just means so much, because for many years June couldn't talk about her experiences. I used to always ask her, what was it like growing up in the South? See, what did you go through? It was very, very difficult.
I'll tell a story about Richard and being at Michigan State University. My daughter was Amy, my daughter's name, they know Amy, and I took two of her friends, Lindsay and, I can't even remember her name anymore, but two of her good friends, to a program that was a Langston Hughes, a poet, just reading Langston Hughes in the dialect and in everything. And at the intermission, I could tell that her two friends were really uncomfortable. And I said, what are you thinking? And she said, we don't understand the language or and I said, don't you read Langston Hughes at your top-rated high school? And no. So went over to see the principal, talked to him. He said, well, we don't have any black students, so we don't do black literature. And I said, there's someone I want you to meet, my friend Richard, who has a consulting group. And he could come and talk to the teachers. But then they talked to Richard, and I said, oh, we'll give you, 2 hours? Was it 2 or 3 hours? It was just nothing. You said no. But the two, Lindsay and the other young woman, became part of the multiracial living program and totally changed their direction.
Yes.
And it was because of going to that one poetry group and knowing that, we talked to the principal about this, and so we found they did no diverse writers from anywhere. I said, okay, if you had students from South America, well, we don't, so we don't do any South American literature either. So and this was in the 80s. No, yeah. Is that right? Before, after that, 90s, in the 90s, 95, 96. So that, it's there, and this was Michigan. So.
Wow. Not even South Carolina.
Not even South Carolina.
So you were a teacher. You were a teacher. Anything you want to share about South Carolina? He was an art teacher. Art teacher.
We don't have enough time. She and I were together.
We were at the same school.
Oh, yeah.
And the only reason I went to that school, I went for an interview. I was going to be a Montessori teacher. And there was Seitu standing outside with beautiful I remember it. I can close my eyes and see it. And I said, I can live at this school. I can make it here. And then we became friends.
Was this Felton?
And that's the story.
Felton?
Was it
Was
Creighton?
this Felton? Or?
No, this was in South Carolina, Kaufman Road.
No, Felton is in South Carolina.
Oh, Felton's in South Carolina. I'm not getting older. Don't forget.
Yeah, I taught in the public schools in Sumter before I came to Kaufman Road, and we were on that corridor of shame. It's still there. We didn't get new television in Orangeburg, South Carolina in the schools until 1992. And they had no air conditioning in one of the schools. I taught at 3 schools at a time. I was an itinerant. And the water was the color of these walls here. And they had to get fluoride treatments on trucks. And I had to be out there around 5:30 in the morning waiting for those kids to come to school. These kids would ride 20 miles to school on the school buses in the woods. And I was out there last 2 weeks ago, and it's still like that.
Oh my goodness.
The schools have been upgraded physically on the inside since then, thank goodness. But it's this state refuses to fund education. In fact, the former governor here got over
100 million
over 100 million
from Barack.
from Barack Obama, and she sent it back.
Yeah.
She did it twice, as a matter of fact. They sent it back. They didn't want those. They do not want education to thrive in the state. It's deliberate. When South Carolina is now in a cabinet form of government now. It used to be you could vote for everybody. Carol Campbell put that thing in place in 1995, and now the governor can pick whoever they want to be in these positions, except for the Department of Education. Now they're trying to go after that now.
Yeah.
But no, it's some things have changed, but the curriculum is still segregated, and but it's really up to the teacher to stop it. because the curriculum is really up here in the head of the teacher. And she'll tell you that's why I stayed in trouble over it so long, because I was bringing stuff in that wasn't in the book. But I had to bring my whole library to school one day,
Oh my goodness.
1,200 volumes. So I brought it to school one day. One of the many times that I got in trouble at school was when this kid asked me about the Confederate flag one day. It was totally off subject. And I asked him, what do you think about it? He said, well, there was a man that went up there who torched it. And he happened to be a friend of mine. he put on a black Santa Claus suit and climbed up there and lit it on fire. And these dumb policemen pepper sprayed him. But guess how they pepper sprayed him? They pepper sprayed him.
Clean up.
They can't ran it down. Oh my God. But here's the thing that a lot of people don't know is that in 1865, Lincoln signed an executive order along with some other things he did that any state in the Union shall not fly the banner of a sworn enemy to the Union.
Oh.
They didn't put that thing back up there until 1964.
Oh.
Which they were violating federal law. So another art teacher friend of mine who graduated from the University of South Carolina along with me, we took this law and we showed it to several of our legislators. They didn't want to do anything with it. They toyed with that for 10 years. They could have brought it down just like that, but it took all this nonsense for that to happen. It was against the law for it being up there in the first place.
Yeah, about the state house.
Yeah, and
Yeah, on the State House.
yeah, and we showed it to him. He said, well, I don't know what to do with this. And so it took the deaths of 9 people.
Yeah.
And Charles.
One of them was my cousin, Senator Pinckney. And another young man from Allen University who used to come to my grade, by the way.
Yeah, just come to my
Yeah,
poetry.
come to my grade on poetry reading. And yeah, it's just a big, people are in the Nile, which is not a river in Egypt.
You know, when
I said
was-
we have a lot of people in this state. Alice, he knows what I'm about to say.
Go for it.
They have what I call PS syndrome. People stupid. And Justin, we don't need to go in this direction. It's insane.
And the University of South Carolina just accepted your father's archives, correct?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, something.
Yeah, and I'm still trying to work with Dr. Donaldson on that project. I think I'm trying to do it with my mom too, but being in this kind of an environment is eye-opening because my parents sheltered me from all of that. But when I met it face to face when I got into college, I went home and said, "Dad, you didn't tell me nothing about this." He said, "Well, son, we're trying to keep you away from it." But
Now, where were you raised?
I'm right here in Columbia.
You never had to deal with it before college?
Well, actually, when I was a kid, they bused me about, they bused me, I've been to 9 different schools before I got to college. I've been to 15 different schools now. Columbia was supposed to desegregate in '68, but it didn't really start until 1973.
USC didn't integrate until the early 70s.
Yeah, and so
They couldn't win at football anymore unless they did.
yeah, they're not winning now. So-
No, they're not.
So, but yeah, it's really up here in the head of the teacher to stop this. It really is to desegregate the curriculum because the contract still says teach.
Yeah.
It didn't say teach the truth. It doesn't say teach the lie. Teach truth. But I was prepared to go through that because very early when I became a Pan-Africanist, I knew from the very beginning that, yeah, you could get fired. But at what cost? I'm not letting these kids go out here unprepared. I love them that much. I'd do it again. So books like yours need to be a part of the curriculum. In fact, I would push it in the curriculum. I would push it. And if they don't like it, so what?
Well, I
Sneak
would
it in their
pick,
book bag, they'll get it.
yeah, I would pick Abercrombie's over mine for high school. Just because mine, I purposely wrote it for university level, so it's just, it's a little much, I apologize. No, it's a little
But
much.
that's great, that's
If you
good.
put it in the hands of the right people, they'll pick it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, when Rich was mentioning the fact that you had a picture in there of a child shaking the hand of the president, that's big time stuff for parents.
Yeah.
See, that's why I mean the book can be used many kind of different ways, certainly in classroom, things like that. But what we learned in working in communities and working with parents and children, you have to connect children and parents together sooner or later. We started like in co-activity with the 2-year-olds and the 3 and 4 and 5, almost like that till they get to juniors and stuff. But parents need help with raising children. The pictures is a way to do that.
Yeah.
You know?
It's very important.
Because most of the things we see happening outside right now is a learned phenomenon. Children are learning how to hate. You know, parents, and sometimes it's part of that, right? Sometimes they don't even know they're doing it, right? But these things that are happening outside now where teenagers are killing children and mass murders and all that kind of stuff, that's a learned phenomenon. So when you unlearn something, it would take example over and over. That's why Abdul Baha, I love Abdul Baha. Because we know that you have to internalize something before you change your behavior. Most educators know that. You know? So the more we have to help people internalize things, the better off we're going to be in the long run. So we use these, I call them tools again, when it's appropriate. And we've learned over the years working with small children and the parents, get them to their parents so the parent and child connect together and they can learn so many things about it in the home. Unlearn that hate stuff, you know? And so, the picture, a parent can talk about that to a child, how much that means, you know?
Yeah.
And that brings us to the NOW, the now. It brings it down to where we are now.
Yeah.
Someplace we got to turn this around. We got to put a stop to the business of teaching folk how to hate. Because that's what's happening. That's what's happening in the schools, every place, churches, everywhere you can name. You know, it's a learned phenomenon. And to unlearn it, for me, it takes out the Baha'i. I mean, I grew up in the South too, and I've been here all my life. But Abdul Baha says something that sometimes we forget it. Look at me, follow me, be as I am. That's a mantra almost for me, because that's what keeps you going. That's what that keeps you stable, keeps you mentally okay, physically, everything okay. And all these tools that come into our grasp, use them now, because we don't have time. It's not like we have a lot of time to get on a different trajectory and turn things around.
And Setu was at Kaufman Road. I knew he worked with drums, and so I would sneak him into my classroom. Remember, because the principal of the school wanted nothing to do with anything like that. No, and she knew we were friends, and it was interesting. But I locked the doors on which I was in a double wide trailer, so that no one could come in. She never came down anyway. And Setu would play the drum, we danced to it, played music, did all this beautiful stuff, and they loved it, you know. And then I brought pictures, books in, you know, and you're right that it's the curriculum has to reflect not just the diversity in your daily life, which is important, but across the board. And there was a wonderful picture on Facebook that a friend of mine put on. Her grandson must be about 2, and there was a bathtub with a black doll in it, and he was giving the baby a bath. And it seems simple, but you know, Abdul Baha talks about that parents from birth must expose their children to all you know, the universe, people. So. And then another time, you didn't come in the room this time. This was, the guidance counselor told me to have a meeting with my crew, the little ones, because they were being really disruptive. And so we were talking about, I don't know what we were talking about, and then one of the little girls said, "Can you sing a spiritual?" Now, anyone who knows me is that I cannot carry a tune. So I asked one of the little girls to sing, and so then we sang along with her. And then this other child, who's a white child, said, I don't like music in those churches." And I said, "What is that? Tell me about that." He said, "Well, it's too loud. And where we go to church, it's very quiet." So we talked about diversity. We talked about some people like to sing loudly and some people like to sing softly. And I said, some people have beautiful voices and we like to hear them sing, and other people try to sing and we need to be nice to them. Like your teacher, instead of saying, "Don't turn on Ella Jenkins," you know, that kind of thing. But it's when you bring it up with children, young children, they will talk to you about it. They're not embarrassed about it. And
Of course, that child heard an adult say that,
yeah,
which is why they're saying it.
yeah.
You just
Yeah.
never
Oh no, I know
did.
that. I know where it was
Sure.
coming from.
Right.
And so I wish I'd had June's book when I taught at Lander, which is a small school, mostly white. The McCants kids went there. For those of you who know Jack McCants, his children went there.
Greenwood,
What?
Greenwood,
Yeah,
tell them the town.
yeah. Oh, Greenwood. But,
Not far from Abbeville.
what?
Not far from Abbeville.
I know, not far from Abbeville. So, and it was just interesting what they didn't know. And so my class became almost a Black history class. They didn't know things. And so it just became really clear. And if I had that book, or a book like that, that would have been the text. And because they didn't know their history. And they didn't want to learn things because they knew they were going to teach at all white schools. So it's, it's interesting experiences like that that make you so aware of how important it is to write about these things and to share them with, you can always move back.
Where did that come from? That just
We're from up north too, and we don't have snow and ice down here.
I'm out to apologize, but I'm out to leave.
Oh.
And I want to say goodbye to my friends.
Okay, good brother.
Thank
So
you.
great.
Thanks so much for everything.
Yeah.
It looks kind of nasty out there.
maybe wait.
Well,
a few
I have to
minutes.
go home.
Okay.
It's an energy thing. If I don't leave, somebody will take me home.
Wonderful to see you, buddy.
Thank you so much.
Please drive safely.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Okay.
you.
In the ring.
Yeah, I was just gonna he raised the question though of children's classes. I think the nice thing about what the House of Justice has offered us is, we can still create those other spaces now, children's classes or devotional meetings where we can kind of counteract whatever lingering problems still exist or whatever racism still exists.
I was talking to one of the guests last night at your meeting, and in fact, I think she said she was a cousin of one of your ancestors or
Oh,
something.
Emily Newman, Emily DeQuincy Newman.
Yeah.
A big woman, tall.
Yeah.
Yeah, tall,
Uh-huh.
very pretty hair.
Yes.
I think she said her name was Jenkins, Carolyn Jenkins.
Okay, no.
Wanna be a cousin.
Anyway, we were.
We're all related, you go back far enough.
Right.
But we were talking about, we got to talking about the political situation where children now are being prevented from reading certain books and
Right.
even Black history writ large. And we said, what can we do? We need to work together, Black and white, to solve this. And she said, oh, absolutely. We exchange cards and we're all excited. And we're going to be in touch, and he said, well, let me know, how to plug in to some movement. And of course I thought of the Baha'i faith, being that movement. But my thinking is that maybe we need to think as a project or a social development to include Black history within the children's class. And the churches could do the same thing. In the basement of the churches, they could be doing this. And all these different, because if we can't teach it in school, we can teach it ourselves, but we have to teach it. So that was our brainstorm, that we should make this a movement, talk to the Christians, talk to the Muslims, talk to the Buddhists, and get everybody doing it like in Iran, when they were forbidden to go to university. They did it in the homes.
One of the things that I see is that works like yours can actually help humanity to see where we are on the timeline of spiritual development. Humanity has not yet, in my opinion, this is a little old me, we have not realized our true identity yet. We're not just human. We're divine, and we don't know it. And once we go from our present state of spiritual development, whatever faith it is, whatever faith that there is on this planet, it's supposed to get you there. Most of the faiths have failed in doing that because a lot of them say, this is the only way for me to do this. Rather than saying, what's the goal? What's the message? This comedian was saying one time, he says, this group says, my prophet is the messenger. This one says, my prophet is the messenger. He said, I don't care who the messenger is. Did you get the message? They got the same message. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Science knows this to be a fact. For every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. He said, don't mess with me, and I won't mess with you. But we missed it.
Yeah.
Well, we haven't missed it though. That's the message of the Baha'i faith.
Yeah.
It's progressive revelation.
Yeah.
That all these messages are from the same source. But what is the message?
What's the message?
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's very much part of our life. Is that whole idea of unity of message,
Yeah.
and then getting the message going.
I think the reaction that we're getting now here in America is that a lot of people don't want to look in the mirror, and that's why you see in this whole thing about what CRT. It's not even taught in any public school. None.
No.
They don't want to look in the mirror and see, hey, what do I look this ugly or do I look this pretty? What? It's that mirror thing that scares them, and that's why it's happening. So books like yours is making them look in the mirror. Look. Now this is where we need to go.
Yeah.
We need to realize our divinity. And so once human beings realize, this is my opinion, once human beings realize their divinity, we can turn this thing around.
You know, there's, I think in one of the latest letters from the House of Justice, there's this sentence that has really, it really struck me, and it reminds me of the part of June's book where she integrates, the Baha'i faith, and it's called the Havens of Hope. And it talks about, our role is to create these havens of hope. And the reason why that really struck me is because, I've been a Baha'i since the early 60s, so about 60 years, during the turbulent 60s and the 70s and 80s and 90s. And I can recall during that period when all these things were happening, there was always a group of Baha'is, even as a young black Baha'i in Detroit when all the riots were going on, there were always a group of Baha'is that created a haven of hope for many of us, you know. And so when they read June's book about all the things that are that was going on, they get to the Baha'i community, and I think what that does is that it gives a glimmer of hope. Basically, it's saying these are the things that the Baha'is were doing in South Carolina, and also what was happening around, you know, around the country. You see, you talk about some of these universal things. These things are also happening in every racially or ethnically divided society on the globe. It's so interesting to note how the Baha'is, in their own little humble, struggling ways, are creating these little, you know, havens of hope.
That's
You
right.
see, and I think that, and you don't have to be a Baha'i to create these havens of hope. You know, you can just have settings like this where people who are disillusioned, you know, with the world, know that they can come, you know, and just, you know, have a place to break bread and to talk about various kinds of things and what have you. June and I were married. When we were married 51 years ago, June wasn't a Baha'i, so we had a Christian, you know, wedding and a Baha'i wedding. And my brother was the best man. And when he came to our wedding, and he, you know, we had an Iranian Baha'i who was like my big brother. He was a professor at Michigan State. He and a black woman were performing the Baha'i ceremony. Then there was a white Baha'i couple playing the guitar. And so we had these people from all racial and ethnic backgrounds. My brother, bless him, who had not been in that type of environment before, the first thing he said to me was, "What is this, the United Nations?" You know, it was just, you know, too much for him. But the interesting thing about it was that Iranian couple always created havens of hope. The Nazarians.
Oh, yeah.
The Nazarians.
Yeah.
You see? And they didn't have, I mean, you know, he was a professor, he was doing cancer research, and she was busy with kids, but they always created that space where, you know, we could go and we could hang out. And what was so incredible about that is that years later, you know, I met them in about 64, 65. They married June and me in 1971. And what was so incredible is that when our daughter was married years later, they were also at that wedding. But you know, there was that couple. There was that couple. You know, just create, you know, where we could just hang out. You know, they just hang out. And sometimes what he would do, sometimes when he would have guests and other people at his house, he would just call and say, "Richard, come over. Just come over." You know, I'm this poor, you know, student one. You know, just come over. And he continued to do that for decades. I was at his wife's funeral, and I shared some of these. You know, they both have passed.
Yeah.
Some stuff. And we don't, you know, I think that's the key thing. We take it for granted, you know, when you're a poor student, you know, and you being invited to places and they're feeding you for decades. Well, you know, that's what Baha'is do, you know. But that you know, that haven of hope also provided us with a place to invite our friends. You see, to demonstrate to them, you know, this is what Baha'is do. You see.
When I was in graduate school, somebody was telling me, I was up in Washington, D.C. in graduate school, these kids, these college kids, and some graduate students, I think up in Maryland, they were invested in a quadruplex theater up in Rockville, Maryland. And man, those kids were awesome, man. They bought this thing and they started showing films about socially relevant ideas, and then they developed breakout rooms. And they had flip charts and everything, how they're gonna do this and how they're gonna do that. Yeah. There are 3 empty theaters right here in Columbia right now that nobody's got. The Baha'i faith can move right into the one. The Columbia Mall is closed now. And y'all can open it up and have those kids go in and do activities and show films about the program. Go on television. You got to do it. You have to go on television. ETV. Is Beryl still there?
Who?
Yeah.
Beryl Dakers.
She was there last night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually meet there. I'm the president of the Media Club for Columbia.
Yeah.
And we've been meeting in their lobby.
Hook up with Beryl. She gets you on. She's a very nice person.
No, she was there last night, right?
Who?
Beryl Dakers.
I don't know her.
She's from the PBS,
Because I,
South Carolina Education Television.
yeah, I spoke to her and I said, "You're from ATV."
Yeah.
And she said, "Oh yeah." And I said, and I asked her about Rudy Menke.
Yeah.
So she, of course,
Yeah.
Started-
Yeah, she's looking for stuff like that.
yeah. But she's an interviewer and a executive, really, probably by now.
Oh, yeah.
Of ETV.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they have programs, but I'm sure you looked into that. For,
I'm not looking for any more right now, thank you.
I need a break, huh?
Not gonna
this
go
trip.
home and take a bath in Michigan. But I think, I think now we're doing things mostly around the world at a more small scale, and those feel really good. Like when the pandemic hit, we started. I know what can you do with Zoom? But we started a weekly devotional meeting. It's usually tonight, actually. It's usually Thursday nights, and we just people of different races come on, and we don't even purposefully talk about like history or anything, but it's mixed race, and we let people form bonds of friendship. The House of Justice says, love and bonds of fellowship and friendship is what's really going to change right now. So those small scale kinds of things, and our court. We live on a courtyard. With 20 households, and so we've been starting to have monthly gatherings outside, outside of our condo, that people come, I think people are looking for fellowship and friendship. Thunder's looking for something going on.
Stores is great. Yes,
No, I
you
was
are.
happy to have some rain. But the nice thing about small size, we had a wonderful children's class where we, it's been some years since we had this, but we kept it up for 3 years. We went to a nearby housing development, and we had children from 6 to 10. We had some that were kind of junior youth and different races of kids, and we just kind of mentored them for, and that kind of intense, small scale, in a small group, sticking with people as they grow. That's kind of what our House of Justice has told us to do, with children's classes or with junior youth activities. So when you sent that to me and it said all those things you guys were doing, that's the same as in Michigan. It's a very consistent program, I think, that makes a lot of sense. But in those small groups, people can share their hearts. They can share their hearts and tell you what's bothering them. I teach a class online. It's with Wilmette Institute. It's called Anti-Black Racism and Building a Unified Society. And I think we have 75 students this term.
That's
It's
wonderful.
from all over the country. And last term we had 100. So it's offered about 3 times a year, and we have maybe a third black, a third white from all over the country. You know, California, Florida, New York, and so they all are like reading different things and looking at videos, particularly about racial injustice. But then on Sundays, everyone signs on Sunday afternoon. We have to break into small groups, you know,
Yeah.
because you need, you know, people need to talk in intimate circumstances. So we, you know, and it's all guided by the Baha'i writings. So we have a lot of Baha'i writings, but still you have to let people talk. So we break them into groups of like 10 or 15 or something, and just let people talk, you know. So we have to, there's something really powerful about having these conversations in small groups so that we can begin to build the unity that needs to happen. I mean, just like this, you know, this is a nice sized group, you know, where people can start to talk through these things, you know, in devotional meetings or, you know, other places where it really makes a difference, you know. So we only have people for 9 weeks in that course, but by the end of it, hopefully they're more knowledgeable about race, but they also have formed friendships and had conversations that can help them cope with what it takes to live in this society that's so split right now. You know.
We started having people over occasionally for a fire pit outside.
Oh, sweet.
But it's for the arts community.
And yeah, we just talk. We don't even we don't have a subject.
Mhm.
People just come and sit and be together.
Yeah, that's what we're doing on our little courtyard. We put out some chairs and a couple of tables, and I've now collected all the email addresses for each of the 20.
Wow.
And so we send a notice. The next one is July 1st. And we just put out we put out like 4 chairs. Rich and I put out like 4 chairs, and say bring your own chair. So they bring their chairs. I mean, it's like a big cul-de-sac, you know, but it's 20 townhouses. They're like duplexes. So you know, they come with their chairs, and we started that maybe 2 summers ago or something, I think. But this time we decided to do it monthly, just so people can talk, you know, and get to know each other. Because we were going in our little garages, you know, and we didn't know who was where or, you know, who. And we try every once in a while to have a conversation, but it's hard when people drive in their garages.
Yeah.
So this weekend, so finally we know the names, right? Because I went around and collected all the names and all the email, not the phone numbers, but just the email addresses. And so I've got 2 collaborators, they're co-hosts for a couple of these. Put out the table and bring, if you want to bring nuts or snacks, you're welcome to. So one of them lives in number 17. We live in number 6. And then her name is Elizabeth. And then another one lives next door to us in number 7. And so for the first time this week, I was able to write someone, you know, email her and say, Beth is moving in. So our neighbor in number 5 was a wonderful neighbor. He moved out, but he had helped us put out the tables and put out chairs and stuff. So he moved away, and so the lady who moved in got locked out, so I got to meet her. Her name is Beth. So basically, she moved in the same day we came to South Carolina. And I was able to email those 2 ladies and say, Beth is moving in, but we're leaving. I didn't even ask them to do anything. But spontaneously, number 17 arose and came over to meet number 5. That would never have happened
Yeah.
3 years ago. I mean, you know, so we're so disunited, you know, that even simple neighboring has kind of died down. So she came over to meet Beth, and then she emailed me and said, you know, I went over, like reporting, you know, like a little kid. I went over and I met Beth, you know.
Yeah.
And then she said, I noticed your flowers. You have flower pots. I got 3 big old flower pots in front of my house. And I noticed the hose was there. Do you want me to water them? I said, neighboring behavior,
Yeah.
you know? So I think if we could just start to build these bonds, you know, interracial bonds, so that people can get to know each other over a long period of time, and then have conversations when they can ask questions about what it is they want to know about, you know, us, or about, you know, anything, race or anything, but not just race, you know, anything they want to know, and build up those bonds. If that begins to happen, you know, with small groups all over the country and all over the world, you know, that's the vision of the House of Justice that we. And if unfortunately everybody in our little courtyard is over 60, we think.
I was gonna
there's
say,
one-
you collected emails. There must
I
have been any young
did.
people in there, because they
They don't do
anymore,
email.
you know?
Yeah, they do
They don't
WhatsApp. Yeah, we've got one
Emails
12-year-old.
going out.
We've got one 12-year-old.
Pay
That's
attention
it.
to the same lesson.
Yeah. They text.
Yeah, that's the only way I can get my grandson to pay attention.
Yeah. We need to formally end this.
Yeah, sure.
You're still filming.
Oh.
Yeah.
So, I'm just coming over here to
To officially end.
say we're ending, so people can
Yeah, we're
relax
gonna have to-
and have some refreshments. And again, thank you.
I think we're gonna have to leave.
You can take so much to have on your life.
Yeah, sure.
You're exhausted.
We're exhausted.
Yeah, you're exhausted. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we thank the Baha'is for your home.
Yes.
And we thank
Yeah.
Jim back there
Yes.
for all the work you're doing.
Yeah.
Invisible Jim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jim is a new Baha'i.
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, welcome.
welcome.
Community.
His first year.
Mhm.